the basis of volume, that is number, distance and means of transport use, international migration may be classified into intercontinental and transoceanic. The international migration is quite older and limited in volume and time. It is caused because of a number of special conditions at the place of origin and place of destination. International migration may be short migration of small groups of people or large groups travelling long distances. Contrary to this, the transoceanic migration has been observed largely in modern times, affecting the chief centers of population in Europe, America, India, China, Japan, Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia. After you have gone through this module, you would be able to understand the reasons for international migration, understand the population redistribution through international migration and understand the causes for recent international migration. The number of international migrants worldwide reached an estimated 272 million in 2019. Nearly 56% of them lived in countries in more developed regions, while countries in less developed region hosted 44%. As many as 65% of all international migrants resided in high income countries, 30% lived in middle income countries and 5% settled in low income countries. In ancient time, there had been large scale exodus of people to Canaan where Jews immigrated. The Bactria and Cydonia were the promised lands for the Persians where they immigrated in large numbers. The Mongols migrated to South China and Thailand around 2000 BC and the people from Central Asia arrived in waves in the subcontinent of India. In India, millions of people from peninsular India migrated to the tea plantations in Assam and Bengal. In the beginning of the 20th century, about 30 million Chinese invaded Manchuria and settled there. Similarly, people from China out-migrated and settled in the different countries. From Southwest Asia, people migrated towards Sudan and the Muslim Fulani moved westwards to the oases of Chad, Algeria, Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Central African Republic, Mauritania, Congo Basin and Cameroon. Along the southern coast of Mediterranean Sea, the Arabs penetrated towards Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Spain, Portugal and France. In America, both before and since the arrival of the Europeans, there had been much migration among the Americans. Until recently, the Amerindian, that is the Red Indian tribes often migrated in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Central and South America. There is much internal migration still in India, Indonesia and Americas. In West Indies and Brazil, the seasonal laborers go to the centers of banana production. From Mexico, there is a constant stream of workers to the United States. The Negro workers migrated from the southern states to the industrial centers in the northeast and the Great Lake regions. Similarly, in India, agricultural laborers from Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh seasonally migrate to Punjab, Haryana, Jammu and Kashmir and western Uttar Pradesh. There had been waves of migration in Europe. In fact, European immigration is the most tremendous displacement of people ever recorded by history, especially after the 17th century. The numbers involved have never been counted. It began well before the 19th century with the discovery of America and its colonization by Spaniards, but it has been estimated that between 1821 and 1910, at least 26 million migrants left Europe for the United States alone. According to one estimates, since the end of the 15th century, at least 105 million persons left Europe for the Americas, Asia, Africa and Australia. In the 16th century, 3 million Spaniards left home for America. Up to the 19th century, only the Spaniards, Portuguese, English, Scots, Irish, Greeks, German, Italian, Belgian and the French nationals were out migrating. The destination of all these peoples was mainly the new countries. Up to 1914, there was a considerable flow to the United States. In 1921, the immigrants' quotas were fixed by an act. The Europeans outmigrated to many countries in Asia, Africa and Australia. The European immigration occurred mainly because of overpopulation and industrialization. The Europeans immigrated in two different directions. One, they entered into the sparsely populated tropical and subtropical coastlands which were easily accessible and which possessed potential for the production of exotic crops because of their hot and humid climates. Consequently, commercial production of sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, tea, spices, indigo, rice and so on flourished in the eastern coastlands of North and South Americas. In order to cultivate these virgin lands, labor had to be imported. Initially, this labor was supplied by the Europeans themselves, but as the demand started multiplying, it gave rise to slave trade from Africa. After the slavery was abolished, the densely populated countries of Asia were exploited by the British and Dutch colonists. Consequently, the semi-slave trade supplied labor to newly developed plantation agriculture areas of Malaya, Sumatra, Sri Lanka, Fiji, Hawaii, East African countries and Mauritius. Secondly, large European immigrants moved into the temperate zone of the Americas, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand. Although people immigrated from England, Scotland, France, Holland, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Italy and other European countries, the outmigration from Ireland was almost one of the unparalleled in the human history. The great exodus was due to an extraordinary increase in the population of Ireland. The country was overpopulated, the physiological density was very high and the people were dependent largely on potato cultivation. The failure of potato crops for successive 3 years, that was 1845, 46 and 48 and higher prices for their meager food meant famine for the whole country. This was the start of rightful poverty and of a vast exodus, a real flood of immigrants which in some years carried off more than a third of the population. Between 1850 and 1900, more than 40 lakh people left Ireland. The check on the movement which began in 1885 was due to depopulation of the country to a dizzy fall in the birth rate. Immigration from the British Isles as a whole represents the greatest swarm of mankind that has ever crossed the sea. About 17 million persons left the island between 1815 and 1926. This steady flood of immigrants has not diminished the population of Britain, where an excess of births over deaths has constantly kept up the total and even increased it. During the period between 1821 and 1932, which is often called as Napoleonic Wars and the Great Depression, there was relatively unrestricted but reasonably well recorded mass movement. At least 59 million people, mostly Europeans, moved overseas during the period. Out of these, over 90% settled either in North or South America. During the 20th century, the largest volume of population transfers had been through forced migration negotiated and organized by national governments. After the First World War, over 1 million Germans moved into Germany from Alsace, Lorraine and the areas ceded to Poland. In the exchange of population between Greece and Turkey, decreed by the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. About 12 lakh Greeks were moved out of Asia Minor and Eastern Thrace, and about 6 lakh Turks were moved from various Balkan countries, mostly from Greece. The German conduct of Second World War resulted in vast movements of refugees and forced labor, and the collapse of Germany set in motion a gigantic series of redistribution of population. The partition of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan in 1947 led to an exchange of population estimated in 1949 at over 6 million in each country. The first phase of emigration from Asia to countries of America, Australia and Eastern Africa began as a result of the abolition of slavery in the British colonies in the 1830s. The demand for plantation labor was met by the recruitment of indentured laborers from India and later from China, Japan and Philippines. Although this class of socially induced migration dominated Asian migration throughout the 19th century, it particularly ceased after the 1920s. The decline in international migration has been offset by an increase in interregional migrations within Asia. Immigrants have contributed greatly to the economic development of Malaysia, that is Chinese and Indians, Myanmar, that is Burma, Indians, Sri Lanka, Borneo and Indonesia. International movements of migrants within Asia continued throughout the 1920s and 1930s despite the near cessation of mass migration in the West. The chief countries of immigration have been China, India, Japan, South Korea and the Philippines. For all the migration, principally to Eastern Africa and Southeast Asia, the effects on the population of the country origin have been negligible. For example, the urban areas of Japan between 1920 and 1940 increased by 17.5 million persons, 10 times the number emigrating Japanese civilians. As another example, about 30 million Indians are estimated to have settled abroad between 1834 and 1937, but since 24 million eventually returned to India. The net outward balance was only 6 million over the span of more than a century. International migration, which includes both voluntary migration for economic or other reasons as well as the involuntary movement of refugees, is on the rise. Data are uncertain and trends are difficult to track, but according to the United Nations, at least 120 million people excluding refugees lived or worked outside of their own country in 1990, an increase from about 75 million in 1965. The annual growth rate of immigration has been steepest in the developing countries, and about half of all international migration takes place within the developing countries. So far as the involuntary migration, that is refugees, is concerned, it was about 18 million in 1993, which has fallen to 14 million in 1996. However, the number of refugees is overshadowed by the increase in the number of internally displaced persons, those who have been forced to flee their homelands by armed conflict, persecution or natural or man-made disaster, but who remain within their national borders. Because of the rising number of civilian wars and local conflicts, the number of internally displaced persons now totals an estimated 30 million worldwide, mostly concentrated in 35 countries. Africa is the worst affected region, with up to 16 million people have been internally displaced. Several million Muslims migrated from Kosovo to Albania and Macedonia in 1999 because of persecution. About 4 million Afghans took shelter in Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan during the period between 1996 and 2001. In the period between 1990 and 2019, the number of international migrants worldwide grew by around 119 million. This growth had accelerated since 2005, while the number of international migrants increased by around 39 million between 1990 and 2005, from 153 million to 192 million. It increased by around 80 million between 2005 and 2019. This corresponds to an average annual rate of change of 1.5% between 1990 and 2005, compared to 2.5% between 2005 to 2019. Between 1990 and 2019, the more developed regions gained 69 million international migrants, whereas the less developed regions added 50 million. Most of the increase in the number of international migrants occurred in high income countries, that is about 98 million, whereas the middle income and low income countries only added about 20 million to their migrant stock, that is 17 million and 3 million respectively. Environmental degradation and resource scarcity can help to trigger mass migration. Population growth, land scarcity and cycle of droughts and floods has encouraged the illegal migration of more than 10 million Bengalis, perhaps 20 million including their descendants, to neighboring Indian states of Assam, Tripura and West Bengal. In 2019, the number of international migrants worldwide reached nearly 272 million, up from 153 million in 1990. European hosts the largest number of international migrants, that is 82 million, followed by North America, that is 59 million, and North Africa and West Asia, about 49 million. The regional distribution of international migrants is changing, with migrant populations growing faster in Northern Africa and Western Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa than in other regions. Forced displacements across international borders have continued to rise. The global number of refugees and asylum seekers have increased by about 13 million between 2010 and 2017, accounting for close to a quarter of the increase in the number of all international migrants. Northern Africa and Western Asia host around 46% of the global number of refugees and asylum seekers, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa close to 21%. Although migration in today's world is having a significant impact on population size in regions of destination, its impact is much less significant in regions of origin. Projection scenarios show that the size of the population of North America would be almost 21% smaller by 2070 with zero net migration, whereas Oceania would be 17% smaller and Europe about 9% smaller. By contrast, the population in regions of origin would be only between 0.1 and just over 3% larger by 2070 under the zero net migration scenario. India has the second largest population in the world. The Satluj Ganga plains, the coastal regions of the peninsular India and the states of Kerala, Maharashtra and Gujarat are particularly the areas of very high density of population. In fact, in many areas India is overpopulated and the population exceeds the capacity of the land to feed it. People even in the less crowded areas like Rajasthan, Himachal Pradesh, Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh are poor. In the historical past also, the major concentration of population had been in the Great Plains of India. Undernourishment in India is traditional and becomes intolerable during the years of drought and famine. Yet, the cultivators are attached to their villages often by religious or social ties. As a result of this attachment with Dharti Ma, which is called as Mother Earth, immigration was considered to be the worst misfortune, especially in the Hindi belt. Emigration, especially movement of the Indian people at substantial scale in India, began after the arrival of British. The British started immigrating the Indian agricultural laborers into the sugarcane growing areas of the tropics, in which it was difficult for the Europeans to work in the fields under the hot and humid climates. In general, the Indians are hardworking and acclimatized to work in the hot and moist climates. They are also eager to make money, live on the minimum, and can work even at low wages, as they are poor and many at times find no employment in their own towns and villages. They are thus ready to emigrate even to the distant places. In the 19th century, the English people started emigrating to those colonies in which sugarcane, tea, spices, banana and rubber were the dominant commercial crops. The first group of Indian laborers was emigrated in the year 1815. It consisted of convicts and criminals transported from Calcutta, now Kolkata, to Mauritius. Mauritius became a real training ground for agricultural laborers on the sugar fields. After 1934, many free workers were attracted by the mild and oceanic climate of Mauritius. Today, out of the total population of 1.2 million persons, there are more than 0.7 million Indians in Mauritius. Hindi and Urdu are followed and spoken by most of the people of Indian origin. For the last several years, even the Prime Minister of this country is Indian by origin. A big colony of about 8,000 Indians exists in Reunion Island, situated near Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. People of Indian origin got settled in the rubber producing areas of Malaysia and sugar cane growing areas of West Indies. After the Second World War, many of the colonies of Europeans were decolonized and independence was achieved by most of the African countries. Owing to these political developments, many of the Indian immigrants were expelled from the African countries. In fact, the Indians were treated as foreigners, and most of the African countries are virtually close to Indian immigrants. Indians began to reach the West Indies around 1840. Their number was the largest in British Guiana and Trinidad, where there are over 2 lakh Indians in each. At present, they number nearly 3 lakh and constitute more than half of the population. These immigrants are mainly from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. In 2019, India was the leading country of origin of international migrants, with 17.5 million persons living abroad. Migrants from Mexico constituted the second largest diaspora with 11.8 million, followed by China with 10.7 million, the Russian Federation 10.5 million and the Syrian Arabian Republic with 8.2 million. History has shown how migration has enriched both economically and culturally. It will continue to do so. The question of how much migration will take place is very uncertain, because migration flows are difficult to predict. Some migration factors are relatively constant, such as demographic trends and economic inequality. Others vary across time, sometimes cyclically, like the sectoral mismatches of labor demand and supply. But two critically important structuring factors are unpredictable, that is, the flaring up of refugee producing hotspots such as Syria currently and Iraq and Afghanistan in the recent past, and the imposition of migration controls by the receiving country.